bought fucking 3 Big Macs at the same time to eat 2 and keep 1 for breakfast the day after. Yeah. It even tastes better the day after.
I used to always keep 1 and put them in the fridge and eat them the next morning for breakfast because I couldn't cook. When we played at the Marquee after the gig, I put on my jacket and I took out the Big Mac from my inner jacket. He said, where did that come from? And I said, oh well, I always have 1 handy.
아 이거는 못 고르지.
Oh please, I know you've got an everyday carry Big Mac. Everybody has one.
How about you please? I'm hungry.
Anyway, some of you may have recognized the 2 voices in that intro. That was, of course, Leif Edling and Messiah Marcolin from Candlemass. This week, we're not really doing a Candlemass episode, but also this is a Candlemass episode, in fact.
그리고 진짜 제가 해보고 싶은 게
That might seem kind of confusing, but bear with me, because I feel like most people have probably heard Candlemass before, at least like the classic 4 albums from the 80s. What I'm going to talk about is some of the circumstances surrounding Candlemass and what made them so unique, because even amongst all of the classic 80s doom metal bands like Trouble, Pentagram, Saint Vitus, Witchfinder General, what have you, all those guys had like very unique and distinct sounds, especially compared to today where there's just like a billion doom metal bands that all sound exactly the same. Even amongst those bands, Candlemass sticks out like a sore thumb. They sound completely different. To illustrate that, let's take a look at Black Sabbath covers, because every fucking doom metal band has one. Here's a Black Sabbath song, it's off Volume 4, it's called Supernaut. And there's a very loose, rollicking groove to it, and quite a bit of a blues influence and groove. Leads into a pretty dank Tony Iommi solo that uses a lot of minor pentatonic scales, little trills on and off, that kind of thing. It's Black Sabbath, we know what they sound like. And when most doom metal bands do a Black Sabbath cover, it usually ends up being pretty straight-laced. But when Candlemass covers Supernaut, it starts out pretty normal during this kind of intro section right here. It's basically just the Supernaut riff, but watch how they hit the groove. Completely different, no sort of bluesy bounce to it at all. It just kind of thuds. It's very like straightforward and not bluesy at all. Speaking of not bluesy at all, check out this fucking Lasse Johansson solo here. That is way different. That's sort of like neoclassical thing. That's what sets Candlemass apart. They do not have the bluesy kind of hard rockish thing, the 70s stuff that's going on in all the other doom metal bands. That doesn't show up in Candlemass. What does show up in Candlemass though? What makes them completely different? That's where we get to the meat of this episode, because we were going to be talking about the context around the formation of Candlemass, because nothing exists in a vacuum. For instance, before Candlemass existed, Leif Edling had a band that had pretty much everybody from Candlemass in it except for their famous vocalists, and it was called Nemesis. And in Nemesis, we get to the root of why Candlemass sounds so different from other doom metal bands. You see, Nemesis wasn't really that much of a doom metal band most of the time. It still has that sort of Candlemass melody, but they're much more sort of like a dark power metal band or even a speed metal band. And I believe that power metal influence, as opposed to like the more bluesy stuff you hear in Sabbath, is what makes Candlemass the way it is. Because when you slow down this kind of stuff, it is not going to sound like what happens when you slow down Black Sabbath. That's how you get Saint Vitus. This is like almost thrash. But it does slow down. And when it slows down is where you can hear the roots of what will become Candlemass. Also, that's Leif on vocals. Leif is the bassist and main composer for Candlemass. In this band, he wrote all the music and he did vocals, which kind of contributes to the feeling that this was literally him trying out ideas for Candlemass before Candlemass existed, before he could really make his vision work. So he kind of worked in more of a standard 80 metal confine. Especially during like the stuff under the solo right here, that is the roots of Candlemass. And I find that to be very interesting, hearing it in more of like a power metal context coming from Nemesis. Honestly, I would not skip Nemesis if you enjoy Candlemass. It's worth tracking down their demos. A lot of them are included as bonus tracks on various and sundry Candlemass compilations. Speaking of trying out ideas for Candlemass, one of the most famous Candlemass songs is probably Demon's Gate off of their first album. And what is that famous for?
안 골라 이건. 포기, 패스.
That's right, the spooky intro. Complete with some of the earliest examples of crazy vocal intros in metal. That weird spooky narration. Leading into a really heavy and really simple kind of dissonant riff. that is clearly building up towards something, which we are about to hear. There we go. Classic Candlemass riff. Perhaps the most notable Candlemass song. Either that or fucking Well of Souls. They're definitely both up there. But what if I were to tell you that Leif Edling actually tried out this concept a couple years prior in Nemesis with the song Black Messiah? Obviously it has a much rawer production since it's more of a demo. But it's still basically the same idea. You got spooky narration, talking about Satan and whatnot, leading into a little bit of a slower riff. That then fades into silence and a faster riff. I really love Leif's vocals on this particular song on their first demo here. Really cool stuff. And in fact, the other guys in Candlemass thought that was a really cool Nemesis song because they actually re-recorded it on the third Candlemass album as Incarnation of Evil. And this one's kind of interesting because I almost sort of prefer the Nemesis version. Here's the Candlemass re-recording. Obviously, Messiah is a much more technically capable vocalist than Leif is. But here's the main difference I want to point out. This is kind of like the heaviest moment of the song, and watch what they do here with the semi-melodic riff. That keyboard overlay right there. Contrast that with how they approach that same section of the song on the Nemesis version. Much harsher vocals. And then right here, listen to this. I actually kind of like it with just the guitars on their own and that slightly heavier kind of string bend that he does. I don't know, maybe personal preference, but I really like how spooky and fucked up Leif sounds on that song. It's kind of like back on the episode I did about Ross and Scald. Agiel's vocals in Ross may not have been amazingly technically competent compared to his later performance in Scald, but there was sort of a soul to it that was just very interesting. I feel the same way about Leif's performance on the Nemesis demos. Speaking of Candlemass redoing Nemesis songs, on the fourth Candlemass album, Tales of Creation, you might have heard a song that went a little bit something like this. And it sounds pretty normal at the beginning. You know, you got a pretty slow, sort of spooky intro riff, but then it starts picking up. And you're like, what in the fuck is this? This doesn't sound like Candlemass. Especially when this part happened. Mappa Bjorkman actually had to cut together the double bass drums in this from multiple takes because it goes so fast compared to what Candlemass usually does. You know, what the hell is going on here? Well, then you go back to the second Nemesis demo, also entitled Tales of Creation, and this same song, Into the Unfathomed Tower, shows up, and it makes much more sense because that was more of a semi-fast power metal album with some doomy parts. In fact, quite a bit of this demo was re-recorded for the first Candlemass album and just kind of reworked into a more doom metal context. See, the whole Tales of Creation thing was sort of a massive concept that had been rolling around inside Leif's head since before the founding of Candlemass. Similar with the song Blackstone Wielder on the first Candlemass album. That goes back to ideas he had during the Nemesis days, and he actually spent, I think, multiple months working out how that song was supposed to go. So that about does it for Nemesis connections to Candlemass. But what did I say the main difference between Nemesis and Candlemass was? Y'all remember?
안녕하세요. 트와이스 지효입니다. 해보겠습니다.
Exactly, the vocals. So what was Candlemass's kind of biggest and most notable vocalist up to before he joined Candlemass? Well, first of all, we gotta get this out of the way. Who is the big Candlemass vocalist? Because obviously Johan on the first album. Obviously, he was a great and very dramatic vocalist. Good at doing these sort of occult narrations. You know, lots of great high notes, that kind of thing. So he was great. And then Rob Lowe on the later Candlemass albums, he doesn't even have anything to prove as a vocalist because he already did so much great work in the 90s with Solitude Aeternus. Again, really good with the epic narrations, the awesome high notes. And he even does this cool kind of like layering thing that's pretty unique. So yeah, he's great too. And honestly, Chapter 6 is a very underrated Candlemass album, and I think Thomas Vikstrom did a really good job on that. He's kind of a favorite of mine because he reminds me a lot of Tony Martin's work in Black Sabbath, and obviously you know I enjoy that shit. But as far as the question of who is the Candlemass vocalist goes,
Come on now.
I think we all know who it is.
Who's that Pokemon?
I mean, really, when you think of Candlemass, you think of vocals, you think of Messiah Marcolin, dude. That's just how it is. Messiah Marcolin, before he joined Candlemass, actually that's a pretty funny story, he actually just called, like, Leif Edling up and, like, sang an a cappella version of the song Solitude off the first Candlemass album. They're like, you're hired. But before he did that, he was in a band called Mercy that actually existed before and after Messiah Marcolin was involved with them. But the two albums he did are definitely worth listening to. The first one is very interesting because it's really not a doom metal album at all. In fact, it sounds a lot like the bouncier songs on like early Metallica albums, specifically Kill 'Em All. And I think that's pretty important because like sort of the distinguishing factor for Candlemass amongst all other doom metal bands is their complete lack of this sort of bounce. But that same bounce is all over Mercy's earlier material, the first album they did with Marcolin on it. And it's a damn good album. It does have some interesting change-ups. Also, check out this solo. What's that make you think of? Exactly, that guitar tone, the note combinations, everything. That gives me a heavy Merciful Fate vibe. So you know I'm going to like that. But let's kind of put a pin in that idea for now, the whole Merciful Fate thing going on, because that's going to become important later. So yeah, no, that first Mercy album is fucking great. Awesome old school heavy metal. The second one is, in fact, a doom metal album, but it's a very different kind of doom than Candlemass. It's much more minimalist. It doesn't have the orchestral feel of Candlemass. And then check out parts like this right here. That honestly sounds a whole lot like Pentagram or even Trouble to me, that sort of layered guitar thing going on there. And it's definitely Messiah on vocals, but he's not doing the wacky vibrato as much as he's normally known for. Remember when I mentioned that whole King Diamond thing coming on? Check this out. Right here. I bet you never thought you'd hear Messiah do something like that. Pretty interesting stuff. He wasn't a guy known for his high notes, but he can sure hit them. And then there's sort of these like cool little transitions into more like kind of speedy heavy metal, power metal-ish shit. Some great solos. So yeah, the first Mercy album and especially the second one, the more doomy one, highly recommend those to see what Messiah was up to before he joined Candlemass. But there are other people involved with Candlemass that also probably had a pretty big effect on the sound. For instance, on the second and probably most famous Candlemass album, Nightfall, there was a lot of contribution from guitarist Mike Weed.
Dude, this is some good weed! Dude, this weed is so good!
He's probably more famous nowadays for playing guitar in King Diamond and doing a whole lot of guest solos on all sorts of different bands' projects. In fact, one of my favorite guitar solos of all time was one that Mike Weed did on Edge of Sanity's second Crimson album. Dude has a pretty unmistakable guitar tone, and I am a big fan of it. I really like this guy's solos, and he was definitely involved with Candlemass kind of on and off throughout the 80s, mostly because Lars Johansson like injured his wrist for a while. But while he was doing that, that wasn't his main project. His main thing was this band called Hexenhaus, who are pretty interesting because they play very technical thrash metal. They did a whole series of albums for Black Mark Productions. That would be Korthon from Bathory's father's label. Also put out Edge of Sanity and Cemetery and Scum, lots of good stuff. But this is interesting right here because it is tech thrash, but does this not sound a lot like Candlemass to you? Or at least like something that was played by people that were clearly influenced by Candlemass. That's going to become important later on when we get even more autistic with our digressions into Candlemass errata. But yeah, no, great solos because it's fucking Mike Weed. He's always got great solos. Vocals are also kind of Candlemassy, which is rather interesting. They didn't start out that way, but by the time we get to this, their third album, there's quite a bit of power metal and doom metal mixed into their tech thrash kind of gumbo, and I find that to be pretty darn interesting. This stop-start part here is cool. I might just like that part because it reminds me of Rosicrucian. But the interesting thing about Candlemass and their relationship to Hexenhaus is after Messiah exited the band for the first time, he actually hooked up with Mike Weed and all the members of Hexenhaus, and Hexenhaus literally turned into a new doom metal band called Memento Mori. Like, that's his vocals, and that is kind of doom metal. It's definitely Messiah singing over doom metal, but it's way different than what he did with Candlemass because it has all this like technical power thrash weirdness going on. Like, this shit's fucking bizarre. You would not hear this kind of shit in Candlemass. And that's kind of what I like, you know, the first Memento Mori album. It's a really unique and kind of weird sounding thing. And of course, you know, great Mike Weed solos, as always. That's an important thing. But yeah, you would not hear that kind of stuff in Candlemass. Or would you? Here's Candlemass's Chapter 6 album that came out right around the same time Memento Mori was a thing. And interestingly, Leif Edling actually kind of went back to his power metal roots on this album, as well incorporating a lot of thrash and a lot of more technicality, which I find to be very interesting. That he sort of looped back around to his older, almost Nemesis style, but with like way more technically complex and progressive shit. Also, I fucking love Thomas Vikstrom's vocals. That's good stuff right there. Like I said, he sounds a whole lot like Tony Martin, and that's never a bad thing. A whole lot of emotion there. So yeah, if you haven't heard this particular Candlemass album, Chapter 6, you should get it, because I would honestly put it on the same level as the first four like classic Candlemass albums from the 80s. And I think that kind of wraps up the whole sort of weird maelstrom morass of contextual bands that are swirling around what makes Candlemass so unique, you know? I just think it's interesting that Candlemass is this institution, but I don't really hear people talk about kind of the other bands that sort of fed into them and made them that way. It's interesting stuff. I don't know. Hopefully you liked it. See ya.
And now, Mr. Hakahito, you can drive through and get your order with 10 seconds to spare.
All right, thank you.